Hello everybody, today I want to talk about books. Many people use literature as a way to learn about and get into contact with different cultures, experiences, religions than the ones they are used to. Also different times. This is very useful and valuable. Research has, for instance, shown that people who read frequently tend to be more empathetic. Yet there are still some caveats and problems with how these books are frequently written. In this video, I want to address two of these issues, as well as recommend some books that either avoid them or tackle them in an interesting way. I have found 15 books written by 9 different authors, covering a wide range of genres, so they should be something for everybody. First, let's start with the big one, Orientalism. This concept was coined by Edward Said, who also wrote the book, of course, and is mostly known for what it says about othering, which is a concept most of you will already be familiar with. But this is not all this book has to say. There's also a lot of things about power and their relationship to knowledge and art. First and foremost, Said claims that most of what we in the West know about the Orient does not actually originate from the region itself. Rather, this knowledge has come to us through the perceptions of Western people who traveled there and then retold their experience after coming home, which made it into science, literature, art, etc. This entails that information does have a strong basis in reality, but has also been filtered through and therefore morphed by the pre-existing ideas, beliefs and worldviews of those Western people who originally told their experiences. This has massively affected and determined how we in the West see the East and actually the entire non-Western world, and is therefore something that we should be aware of when dealing with those areas. In Said's own words, ideas, cultures and histories cannot seriously be understood or studied without their force, or more precisely, their configurations of power also being studied. One of these ideas with a very big impact is the belief in the inherent superiority of Western knowledge, which is still very prevalent today. Later in this video, I will also give an example of this. At first, Orientalism was something that was used mostly in the arts and academia, but it very quickly became political and grew to have real-life consequences with a huge impact. The apparent superiority of Western tools and knowledge acted as the ideological justification and legitimation of colonialism. In the book, Said exemplifies this by discussing the English domination of Egypt and how this was motivated. The argument has also obviously been influenced by the ideas of Michel Foucault, and for whom discourse was something productive and material. The practices and dynamics are being described in Orientalist discourse were subsequently translated into reality and manifested in real life only after having been expressed in discourse. In other words, Orientalism as a way of thinking was quickly institutionalized in, amongst others, politics and academia. If you are interested in this relationship between academia, colonialism and Orientalism, I highly recommend Babel, an Arcane History by Rebecca Kwong. This is a story of a Chinese boy who is being taken in by an English professor who sends him to Oxford University to study languages. While living in England, Robin starts to question the professor, the university, and also his own complicity in colonialism and British imperial rule. It is also a fantasy novel with a magic system that gives language literal power. R.F. Kuang, who wrote this book, is a Chinese-American author with a master's in contemporary Chinese studies from Oxford, who is currently pursuing a PhD in East Asian languages and literatures at Yale. So she definitely knows what she is writing about, both regarding the setting of Oxford as the subject matter of Chinese history and colonialism. If, according to Said, part of the problem is that much of what we read about the non-Western world has still been filtered through a Western lens, then one thing that you can do is start reading more diversely. Look for people with different views and experiences than your own. Start reading books written by queer people, or by people of color, people with a different religion than you, You don't even have to go very far outside of your own world to do this. For example, if you're from the US, you can also read about the experience of the African American community. I have gathered 5 books by 4 Black artists who all write in a different genre. The first author I want to recommend is a very straightforward one, Toni Morrison. She writes mostly literary fiction and received the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1993. I have read 2 of her books, first of which is her debut novel, The Bluest Eye, which tackles themes of internalized racism and cyclical repression. Secondly, there is Beloved, which deals with generational trauma and slavery. Especially Beloved is very difficult to read, but both on an emotional and a technical level, but it is really worth it. Another book that deals with racism, but has a more science fiction take on it, is Kindred by Octavia E. Butler. This is a science fiction book in which a black woman from the 1970s travels back into time and has to survive on a plantation. If you want something more contemporary or catered towards young people, I recommend The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas. This book was written as a part of and as a reaction to the Black Lives Matter movement of the 2010s. Finally, there is Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates. This book is his memoir in which he tells a story of how it was to grow up as a black man in the USA, and it is written as a letter to his son. But what about those texts that were criticized by Said because they were written about the Orient, but through a Western lens? Should we stop reading them altogether, or are they still valuable? Of course, it's the latter. For one, because these books tend to be about much more than only Orientalism. More importantly, because these biased views still represent a very important part of the puzzle of Orientalism and its contemporary impact. So instead, Said recommends doing something that he calls contrapuntal reading, which is reading a text while being aware of and looking for the hidden biases of the author hidden in the text. What is the author telling us? What not? What are they telling us to think and believe? What are their hidden assumptions? What are the gaps in their knowledge and experiences? And what can this text teach us about the author and their worldview? And by extension, about our own worldview, about our own beliefs. This is something that is not only relevant for Orientalism, but any piece of literature. Because whatever piece of art you are consuming, it will reflect the beliefs and worldview of its creator in one way or another, which is what makes engaging with literature so fun. An interesting book in this context is another one you are probably already familiar with, namely Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. This is mostly known for its marriage plot and the depictions of emancipation and class difference, but it also has a lot of Orientalist elements, especially regarding the portrayal of Bertha Mason, Mr. Rochester's first wife, who is from the Caribbean. Bertha Mason is portrayed as exotic and irrational to the point of literal madness. This way she serves as a counter to Jane Eyre, who in comparison appears more pure and proper and English. They are put in a binary, just like the Occident and the Orient, or the West and the East, were put in a binary to legitimize Western superiority and, by extension, Eastern inferiority. The reason I picked this book specifically is because in the 1960s, Jane Eyre actually got a prequel named White Sargasso Sea, written by the Dominican-British author Jean Rhys. This book tells the story of Bertha Mason, then still called Antoinette, when she was living in Jamaica, and it ends with her being married to Mr. Rochester and traveling to England. For my second criticism, I want to address an article by Chandra Mohanty called Under Western Eyes. Just like Orientalism, this is already an older article written in the 1980s, but its points are still very relevant. Mohanty criticizes Western feminism and its very reductive depiction of women in the non-Western world. Western feminists tend to believe that women's problems are the same wherever they are, which results in a discursive homogenization and systematization of the issue, which disregards things like diversity and intersectionality. A famous example of this is the first United Nations Women's Conference in the 1970s. Back then, many American feminists traveled to Mexico expecting to find a global sisterhood united in the fight against patriarchy. But what they found is that many of the women from the global south actually had very different ideas on what their problems were and how these should be tackled. They did not consider patriarchy to be their biggest problem, but rather things like capitalism and class difference. A similar dynamic took place after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when many Western feminist organizations traveled to Eastern Europe to help the women there emancipate themselves. But they did this without actually involving the women they were trying to help. If you are interested in this, I highly recommend the article "The Enemy of My Enemy is My Friend" by Ghodsee. This dynamic is problematic for several reasons. To begin with, it robs these women of their historical and political agency. They themselves are not allowed to take part in the discussion of their problems or how to tackle them. It's therefore a good example of how the Orientalist idea that Western knowledge is superior is still very prevalent today, as I discussed earlier in this video. It reflects a paternalistic attitude which sees the non-Western world as underdeveloped and the West as a superior example the rest of the world should strive towards. Another issue is that this process of homogenization heavily relies on stereotypes and binaries. Women from the third world are all lumped together and automatically defined as being repressed by men, illiterate, religious, family-oriented, etc. There is no distinction between a woman in Uganda or in India, between working or upper-class women, and so on. It recognizes diversity within and between different societal groups, as well as the intersectionality affecting them. It is important to read as many different voices as possible. This is part of the reason why earlier in this video I recommended so many different books by authors who all wrote about the experience of Black people in America. For this part specifically, I want to recommend The Buddha in the Attic by Julie Otsuka. This book tells the story of the Japanese picture brides who traveled to the USA in order to get married and then ended up in the concentration camps of the Second World War. What makes this book so unique is that it was written in the first person plural, so in the we form, in order to highlight and foreground the wide range of experiences this group of women had. She is a journalist who traveled the entire Soviet Union, or former Soviet Union, to talk to people, listen to their stories, and then retell these stories in her books. All of these different stories meet and interact as if they were one big choir of experiences. And for my final recommendation of today, I have 3 more books by another Nobel Prize winner, Svetlana Alexievich, who won the prize in 2015. She is a Belarusian journalist who traveled to the entire Soviet Union, or now former Soviet Union, to interview people, listen to their stories, and then retell these stories in her books. This way she creates a big choir of experiences, all centered around a certain theme. I own 3 of her books, which are The Unwomanly Face of War, about the women from the Second World War, Boys in Zinc, about the soldiers in Afghanistan and the families, and Chernobyl Prayer, also sometimes called Midnight in Chernobyl. She also has 2 other books, Lost Witnesses and Secondhand Time, about the children of the Second World War and the implosion of the Soviet Union, which I also recommend. Anyway, these were my 15 recommendations to diversify your reading. I hope you found something you like, or perhaps you already noticed some of these problems and already read some of these books. Do you have your own recommendations, or did you notice any similar issues? Please let me know in the comments. I'm dying to know all about it. And thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe, and see you next time.